Be me, Garrett, 32 years old, chief engineer on a container ship under a foreign flag. 6 months out at sea, 6 months on land. That's the deal. That's been the deal for 9 years now. Good money, around 180 grand a year. Before I tell you what happened last fall, you need to know what I was walking back into. Every time the ship docked. 4 years married to Saoirse. She has a degree in something I still can't say without laughing. Works for a small nonprofit, makes about 42 grand a year. Teaches a free women's self-defense class at the community center on Saturdays. This becomes important later. Hold on to it. Back when we met, I thought she was the most interesting person I'd ever talked to. Sharp, funny, opinionated, the whole package. We met at a bar near the port the week I came home from a contract. She asked me what I did. I told her. She said she'd never met a real engineer before. Asked questions, listened to the answers, laughed at my jokes about diesel fuel, which is not a thing most people laugh at. About 2 months after the wedding, the funny part disappeared, and only the opinions stayed. By year 2, everything I did was an example of something. Me holding the door was performative. Me paying the mortgage was control. Me asking how her day went was a way of monitoring her. I learned to nod. That was my main skill on land, nodding. At sea, I fixed diesel engines the size of houses, but at home I nodded. The house is mine. Bought it in 2019 before we even started dating. My name on the deed, my name on the mortgage, my name on every bill that keeps the lights on. The car is mine. The boat in the driveway. I never have time to use is mine. The health insurance she lives under is mine. What was hers? Her opinions, mostly. And a sister named Rowan who called every other night. Rowan is a professor at a small school somewhere up north. I never met her in person, only heard her voice through the phone for 4 years. She has the kind of voice that makes you turn the volume down by reflex. Every conversation between those two ended with me being a case study. I'd come up from the garage and hear my own name being used like a diagnosis. Quiet aggression, financial coercion, emotional withholding. I was withholding by being on a ship for 5 months at a time, apparently. The ship was a choice, you see. I chose distance. That was the framing. Not the fact that the ship paid for the house we lived in. Let me back up a little and explain the marriage itself. Year 1 wasn't actually that bad. She had some quirks, but everyone has quirks. She didn't want to take my name when we got married. I said fine, doesn't bother me. She wanted to keep a separate friend group I never met. I said fine, doesn't bother me. She wanted to skip my mother's birthday because she said my mother's worldview made her uncomfortable. I said fine, but I went alone. Each little thing on its own was nothing. Added up over 4 years, they were everything. The second year is when Rowan started calling more. I don't know if Rowan caused the shift or just noticed it before I did. They'd talk for 2 hours at a time. I'd come into a room and the conversation would change tone. I'd leave a room and Saoirse's voice would drop into that low, intense register she only used with her sister. At some point, my name started showing up in those conversations, not as a person, but as a topic. Let me tell you about my friend Kane. We served together in the Merchant Marine about a decade back. He got out, went to law school, now works as a maritime attorney, specializes in divorces involving men in shipping. He sees 20 of these a year, he told me once. Same story every time, different names. About 2 years into my marriage, Kane took me out for a beer when I was back on land. Asked me one question. Are you happy? I didn't answer. He said, when you're ready, call me, and I'll tell you exactly what to do, step by step. I wasn't ready that night. I went home, and Saoirse was on the phone with Rowan again, talking about a documentary she'd watched. Something about how men who work in male-dominated industries develop what she called armored masculinity. That was me she was describing, sitting at my own kitchen table. I made myself a sandwich, ate it standing up, and went to bed. I dreamed about engines. I always dream about engines when I'm on land too long. Around that same period, something else started happening. Saoirse stopped cooking. I mean, she'd never cooked much, but she'd at least made simple meals once or twice a week. That ended. She explained it one evening when I asked. Said she'd been thinking about how kitchens had historically been used to confine women. Said preparing food for a man, even casually, reinforced a pattern she wasn't going to participate in anymore. I said, "That's fine, I can cook." She said no. The point wasn't whether I could cook. The point was the symbolic weight of who feeds whom. I said, "Okay." I started cooking for myself, ordering food when I didn't feel like it, and gradually stopped expecting any meal she'd had a hand in. In 4 years of marriage, she never made me a single dinner. I want to be clear about that, not as a complaint, just as a fact. Not one. The moment I finally called Kane was about 1.5 years ago. I'd just gotten back from a 4-month run through the Pacific, brought Saoirse a hand-carved necklace from a market in the Philippines, spent 2 hours picking it out. The vendor was a kid with a missing tooth and a wide smile. Kid told me his grandmother carved them by hand from old wood. I paid him almost double what he asked, because the carving was really nice, and the kid needed it more than I did. Got home, gave it to her over dinner. She opened the box, looked at it for about 3 seconds, and said something I won't forget. She said it was beautiful, but she had to ask, was I trying to apologize for being gone? I said no. I just thought she'd like it. She said it was interesting that I'd thought of her, because lately she'd been working through some thoughts about toxic masculinity in long-distance partnerships. Those were her exact words at the dinner table while holding the necklace. Then Rowan called and Saoirse took the phone into the bedroom. I sat there with the open box on the table. The necklace had a little carved fish on it. I closed the box and put it on the shelf next to the door. I called Kane from the porch at around 11 that night, told him I was ready. He said, "Thank God, I was going to call you next week anyway." Here's what Kane laid out, in plain English. Step 1, separate finances starting immediately. Not joint to separate, just shift the income stream. I had my shipping company route 60% of my salary into an account at a credit union she didn't know existed. The joint account kept enough flowing through it that nothing looked different on her end. Step 2, document everything. Every time she said something like, "I don't believe in this institution," screenshot it. Every time Rowan said something quotable through the phone, write it down. Every receipt for the house, the car, the insurance, save it in a cloud folder Kane could access. Step 3, the prenup. Here's the part where past me did something right for once. Before the wedding 4 years ago, Kane had basically begged me to get one. I brought it up to Saoirse, and she signed it without reading it. Said something about it being a formality of the patriarchy, and she didn't recognize the legitimacy of marriage as a property institution anyway. Kane, the sly bastard, had been recording our engagement dinner that night on his phone, said he was making a toast video. He caught her saying exactly that, on camera, holding the signed prenup. He saved that file for 4 years. Step 4, patience. Kane told me the goal was simple. Wait until she did something that would let me end the marriage cleanly, without her being able to spin it as me leaving her out of nowhere. He said women like Saoirse always do something. They need a public gesture, a moment of declaration. Just wait for it. So I waited. About 18 months of waiting. During that time, life kept happening on its own track. I'd come home from a run. She'd be by the pool with 3 of her self-defense students. My pool, by the way, in my backyard. They'd all go quiet when I walked out with a beer. One of them, a younger woman with a buzz cut, used to actually stand up and leave the patio whenever I sat down. I asked Saoirse about it once. She said the woman was processing trauma and didn't feel safe around male presences. I said I'd been on a boat for 4 months and just wanted to read in the sun. Sarasa said maybe I should be more aware of how I take up space in my own backyard. I started reading inside after that. Another thing during that period, Sarasa signed up for some workshop online that cost $1,200, charged it to my card without asking. I saw the transaction on my phone in a port in Spain. Called Kane, asked if I should bring it up. He said no, let it stand. It's another data point. So I let it stand. Came home, didn't mention it. She didn't mention it either. That's what the second half of the marriage was like. 2 people running silent next to each other. Her loud about everything else, silent about us. Me silent about everything, loud only in my own head. Around the same time, I started actually paying attention to her self-defense classes. She'd put short clips of them on her phone and show them to her sister sometimes. I'd see them over her shoulder when she didn't realize I was there. Once or twice, I asked her to send them to me. Said I wanted to support what she was doing. She said sure she'd send them, never sent them. So I started watching them in the spaces she left them open. They were maybe a dozen women, ages all over the place. Sarasa would walk them through how to break a wrist grab, how to elbow someone in the throat. Fine, normal self-defense stuff. But then she'd start talking. She'd use me as an example, never by name. She'd say things like, "My husband is a textbook case of passive male control." She'd say things like, "The worst kind of male toxicity isn't the man who yells. It's the man who listens calmly while you tell him your boundaries, and then quietly continues to dominate the space." That was me she was describing to 12 strangers in a community center. The man who listened. I'd close the screen and stare at the ceiling of whatever room I was in. If I was on the ship, the engine room hummed 3 decks below. If I was home, she was downstairs talking on the phone or reading on the couch. Either way, I'd just stare at the ceiling and think about how much money was in the credit union account. Just over $200,000 by then. Another data point. Let me tell you about a specific moment that summer that stayed with me. I'd been on a long run, came home with a sunburn from working on deck through the equator. Walked into the kitchen. Saoirse was on the back porch with 2 of her students. Didn't hear me come in. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window listening. One of the students was actually defending me, said something like, "Your husband sounds like he provides a lot of stability, and you should appreciate that." Saoirse laughed, told the student that's exactly the kind of conditioning the class was trying to undo. Said women had been taught to be grateful to men for the bare minimum. Said any man who pays bills in this economy isn't doing his wife a favor. He's just performing a basic contract he agreed to. The student didn't push back. Saoirse moved on to a different topic. I drank my water and walked back upstairs and didn't tell her I'd been there. That night, I added another item to the documentation folder. The conversation that finally triggered everything happened about 7 or 8 months ago. I was overhearing it. I wasn't supposed to hear it. Saoirse was on the phone with Rowan on the back porch. Didn't know the kitchen window was open. I was inside making coffee. Rowan was telling her she needed a radical gesture. Those exact words, radical gesture. She said Saoirse had been performing the role of wife for too long, and the women in her self-defense community could tell she was compromising. Saoirse asked what kind of gesture. Rowan said take back your maiden name, do it loud, do it in front of him. She said it would shatter his ego and reset the power dynamic in the marriage. Saoirse said she'd been thinking about that for a while. They talked for another hour about timing. Rowan suggested doing it when his ship was in port, when he was just back from a long run, when he'd be tired and emotionally vulnerable. That was the actual phrasing. Tired and emotionally vulnerable. I poured the coffee, took it to my office, called Kane, told him exactly what I'd heard. Kane laughed, an actual laugh, first one I'd heard from him in years. He said, "Okay, here's what we do. We time everything to her gesture. When she announces it, you file. Same day. She gives you the public moment, you give her the legal one." So we started preparing in earnest. Over the next few months, I made sure every document was airtight. Kane drafted the divorce filing and kept it ready to submit. My shipping company knew I had a contract coming up for a 5-month run starting in late October. I signed the contract 3 weeks before I told Sercha about it. Kept the dates to myself. During those final months at home, I made one small change that turned out to matter. I started being warmer. Not fake, just deliberately friendly. Asked about her day, thanked her for small things, complimented her cooking on the rare occasion she heated something up in the microwave for both of us. I wanted her to remember those weeks later as a period when I was being a good husband. I wanted there to be no story she could tell about how I'd been distant in the lead-up. She actually softened a little. Told Rowan on one of those calls that maybe the marriage was finally entering a new phase, that I was starting to do the inner work, that her self-defense class was apparently rubbing off on me in a healthy way. I heard that one through the window, too. Rowan's response was the first thing that night that made me genuinely smile. Rowan told her not to be fooled, said that men like me reset when they sense a threat, that the softness was probably tactical, called it textbook. And the funniest part is, she was completely right, and her own sister still didn't believe her. Last fall, I came back from a run through Southeast Asia, landed at the airport, took a rideshare home instead of telling her to pick me up. Did not announce my exact arrival. Told her sometime late afternoon, vague on purpose. Kane met me 2 blocks from the house. He was sitting in his car with the folder on the passenger seat. I got in, he handed it to me. Said, "You sure?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Good, because she already filed something at the courthouse last week." I asked what. He said she'd put in a formal name change petition with the county. Turned out she'd started the legal process to take her maiden name back about 10 days earlier. Without telling me. She was building up to the announcement and wanted the paperwork already moving for dramatic effect. Kane had a friend at the courthouse who flagged it for him. I sat in his car for a minute. Then I laughed. I don't laugh much, ask anyone in my engine room. But I laughed. I said, "Okay, let's go." He said one more thing. He said, "I filed your divorce paperwork this morning at 9:14. Before you even landed. Everything was already in motion." He also said one of his colleagues had been briefed and was on standby in case we needed a witness for anything that happened in the house. I asked what he meant by witness. He said in case she tried to claim something later. Said he wanted everything bulletproof. That's the kind of friend Kane is. I walked up to the house with my sea bag over my shoulder. Could hear voices through the door. Multiple voices, women's voices, the kind of cheerful murmur of a group of people who think they're alone. Opened the door with my key. Walked into the living room. 6 women sitting on my couches and the floor cushions, holding teacups and small plates with cookies. Recognized 2 of them from the self-defense class videos. The woman with the buzz cut was there. An older woman I'd seen a couple of times in the backyard was there too. Sarasa was standing in the middle of them mid-sentence, frozen when she saw me. Then her face changed. She smiled. It was the kind of smile a person makes when they realize the universe just handed them a stage. She said, "Girls, hold on." She said this is actually perfect timing. She pulled out her phone, called Rowan, put her on speaker, set the phone on the coffee table. Rowan's voice came through, asking what was happening. Saoirse said, "Big sister, I'm doing it now." I just stood there with my sea bag. The women on the couches were watching us. One of them looked uncomfortable, kept glancing at the door. Saoirse turned to me and started a speech. She said she had something to tell me. She said for 4 years she'd been carrying a name that wasn't hers. She said the name represented a property structure she'd been complicit in against her own values. She said as of next week, she was legally returning to her maiden name, and she wanted me and her community to witness it. She said this was her boundary. She said this was her line in the sand. The women on the couches clapped. Not enthusiastically, but they clapped. Rowan's voice came through the phone, said something I'll keep clean and call it a celebration cheer. Saoirse waited for my reaction. Here's the thing about her at that moment. I knew her well enough to read the script she was running in her head. She was expecting one of three things. Option 1, I'd yell, which would prove I was an angry, controlling man. Option 2, I'd plead, which would prove I was a weak, emotionally dependent man. Option 3, I'd cry, which would prove I was finally breaking through the male toxicity she'd been working on. Any one of those outcomes was a win for her in front of her audience. She had no fourth option in her head. I gave her the fourth option. I put my sea bag down on the floor. I smiled. I don't think I'd actually smiled at her in 2 years. She saw the smile, and her face flickered for a second. I said that's perfect timing for me, too. I said I've actually been wanting to talk to you about separation. I unzipped the side pocket of the sea bag and took out the folder Kane had given me, placed it on the coffee table next to her phone. The room got very quiet. The only sound was Rowan asking through the speaker, "What was happening? What is he doing?" I sat down across from Saoirse, opened the folder, walked her through it the way I'd walk a junior engineer through a fault diagnosis, calmly, in order, no emotion, step by step, like reading off a checklist. I said the house was bought by me in 2019, before we met, separate property, under state law. I showed her the deed. I said the car is in my name only, paid from my personal account, also separate property. Showed her the registration. I said we have no joint savings, none. I've been routing 60% of my pay into a separate account at a credit union for the past 18 months. Showed her a printed statement. Her face when she saw the balance, I won't forget that either. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I kept going. I said, here's the prenup you signed 4 years ago. Showed her the document with her signature. Showed her, on my phone, the video Kane had taken at our engagement dinner, where she explained on camera that she didn't believe in marriage as a property institution. Her own voice came through my phone speakers, 4 years younger, completely confident, telling all our friends that she rejected the property structure she'd just signed into. Saoirse said something quietly. I didn't catch it. I kept going. I said Kane filed the divorce paperwork this morning at 9:14. I said I'm leaving on a 5-month contract in 6 days. I said the locks will be changed by the property management company the day after I leave. I said you have those 6 days to take your personal belongings and arrange a place to stay. Then I took the second set of house keys out of my pocket and put them on top of the folder. And I sat back. Saoirse stared at the keys. Then she looked up at me and said it. She said, Garrett, I love you. First time in 2 years she'd said it. I didn't respond to that. Rowan's voice came through the phone, much louder now. She was saying, this is financial abuse. This is coercive control. You need to file a counterclaim immediately. She was running through legal terms she'd clearly picked up from somewhere. Her voice climbed higher with every sentence. Kane stepped in from the kitchen. I forgot to mention, he'd come in through the back about 10 minutes earlier and was just standing there listening with a glass of water. He picked up the phone off the coffee table. He said, hello, Rowan. This is Kane. I'm Garrett's attorney. He said, I heard your suggestion about a counterclaim. He said, let me explain why that would be the worst decision you could give your sister tonight. He walked Rowan through it in maybe 90 seconds. The prenup, the recorded statement, the separate property documentation, the lack of joint assets. He said any counterclaim would be dismissed on the prenup alone. He said the recorded engagement video makes a coercion defense impossible. He said your sister would owe legal fees on both sides. He said the smartest thing she could do tonight was not give her sister any more advice. Rowan went quiet for the first time in 4 years. Then she hung up. Actually hung up on her own sister. The room was still. And that's when one of the women on the couch spoke up. It was the woman with the buzz cut. She said, Saoirse, you told us this was your house. She said you told us last month at class that you'd put your money into this house. Another woman, an older one, said you told us about financial independence from male partners. That was your whole talk in September. She said you told us you'd built your own life. She said you told us specifically not to be like the women who depended on their husbands for housing. Saoirse looked at her students, opened her mouth, closed it, didn't say anything. I watched her search for something to say and not find it. That was the most honest she'd looked in 4 years. Silent, blank, no script. The woman with the buzz cut stood up. She said, I think I should go. She picked up her tea, walked her cup to the kitchen, came back, picked up her bag, and left. The older woman left next, then the others, one by one. None of them slammed the door. None of them said anything dramatic. They just left, quietly, the way you'd leave a funeral. The last one to leave was a younger woman who'd been sitting on the floor. She stopped in the doorway, turned around, looked at Saoirse, and said, I won't be at class on Saturday. Then she closed the door behind her. Saoirse and I were alone in the living room, with Kane standing by the kitchen. She stared at the closed door for maybe a full minute. Then she turned to me. She said, Where am I supposed to go? I said, Your parents, or Rowan. She said, After everything I didn't let her finish. I said, Saoirse, you never cooked me a meal. She said that wasn't fair, that I was changing the subject. I said the necklace from the Philippines is still in its box on the shelf by the door. I checked before I came in. You opened it once 2 years ago and put it back. You never wore it. That's not changing the subject. That's the whole subject. She didn't say anything. I stood up. I said I'm not losing a wife. I said I'm losing a sponsorship. Then I went upstairs to take a shower. Kane let himself out. I won't drag out the next 6 days. Day 1, Saoirse called Rowan, then her parents. Rowan apparently said her apartment was too small. Her parents agreed to come down with a minivan. Saoirse spent most of that day on the phone, voice low, voice cracked, voice sometimes shouting and sometimes pleading. I stayed in the garage with the door open and let her have the house. Day 2, she went to her nonprofit job and learned that one of the self-defense class students had already reached out to the board about a credibility concern. The director asked her to take paid leave for a few weeks while they worked through it. She came home that afternoon and went straight to the bedroom and didn't come out for the rest of the day. I left a sandwich outside the bedroom door around dinner time. Not because I owed her anything, just because that's the kind of thing I do. The plate was still there in the morning, untouched. Day 3, she packed. I was downstairs in the garage, cleaning a part I'd been meaning to clean for 2 years. Heard her crying once, upstairs, around the bedroom. Didn't go up. About an hour later, she came down with a small box in her hand, the necklace box. She'd opened it again. She put it on the kitchen counter without a word and went back upstairs. Left it where she put it. Day 4, her parents arrived. Her father, a quiet man I'd only met 3 or 4 times, did most of the loading. Her mother stood by the minivan and didn't look at me much. At one point, her mother walked over to where I was standing on the porch. She said something that surprised me. She said I told her to listen to you sometimes. That's all she said. Then she went back to the minivan. Her father came up onto the porch after the last box was loaded, shook my hand, said nothing, but the handshake was firm and held a second longer than necessary. I understood what he meant. Day 5, Saoirse was almost done. She came over to me by the garage. She said, "Can we talk?" I said, "About what?" She said, "About us." I said there isn't an U.S. Saoirse. That was the whole point of the conversation in the living room. She stood there for a while. Then she said I should have opened the box again sooner. I said, "Yeah, you should have." She said one more thing before she went back to her packing. She said she'd been listening to Rowan for too long. She said it like she expected it to mean something to me. I said Rowan didn't pay the mortgage. That was the end of that conversation. Day 6, she was gone before I woke up. Just an empty house and the smell of her shampoo in the upstairs bathroom that lingered for a week. I drove to the port that afternoon, met Kane at a bar near the docks. He had 2 beers waiting. He asked how I felt. I said honestly, the same as I do before any contract. He laughed, said that's about right. We drank for an hour, didn't talk much, didn't need to. At one point, he told me one of the women from the living room had reached out to him. Not the buzz-cut one, the older one. She'd looked him up after hearing his name in the room. She'd told him she felt she owed a statement about how Saoirse talked about me in classes. She'd been holding on to it for a while. Kane filed it as a precaution in case anything got contested later. Nothing did, but he wanted insurance. I went to the ship that evening. Captain met me at the gangway, shook my hand, said, "Welcome back, Chief." My crew was already aboard, half of them I'd sailed with before. Walked down to the engine room to do my walkthrough. Everything humming, everything in order. That's what I needed. 5 months at sea ahead. When I got back, the divorce was final. The house was empty and quiet and mine. I sold it 3 months after that, bought a smaller place closer to the water. Didn't want the bedroom, didn't want the pool, didn't want any of the rooms where I'd been a case study. Started over with a place that was just mine from day one. About Saoirse, I heard a few things secondhand. She moved in with her parents for a while. Tried to get back into her non-profit work, but the credibility issue at her old place had spread through the small network of similar groups in the region. She ended up taking a job at a coffee shop while she figured out her next move. Rowan apparently stopped calling her as often. I think Rowan realized she'd given advice that backfired and quietly distanced herself. I have not heard from Saoirse directly. She hasn't reached out, which is the one mercy in all of this. I haven't dated since. Not because I'm bitter. I want to be clear about that. I'm not bitter. I'm just careful now in a way I wasn't before. I learned what a quiet 4 years of being the example in someone else's class costs you. And I learned that the women who clapped at her announcement in my living room were also watching the whole time. Some of them weren't on her side. They were just in her audience. The moment the story shifted, they shifted too. That surprised me more than anything Saoirse herself did. They could see it. They probably saw it for a long time. They just didn't say anything until they had a reason. I think about that sometimes when I'm in my bunk at sea, the engine humming 3 decks below. About how often the people around something difficult can see it clearly and stay silent because the social cost of speaking up is too high, and how it only takes one moment of the truth being put on the table for everyone to suddenly be free to admit what they already knew. That's what the folder on the coffee table did. It didn't change anyone's mind. It just gave everyone permission. Anyway, that's the story. If you're a guy reading this and something about it sounds familiar, don't yell, don't argue, don't try to talk it out at the kitchen table for the 80th time. Get a guy like Kane in your corner. Build the paperwork quietly, document everything, and wait. They always do the gesture. It's a matter of time. Then you smile, take out the folder, and put it on the table. That's the whole trick. One last thing before I close this out. About a month after I got home from that next contract, I was unpacking some boxes in the new place. Came across the necklace. I'd taken it with me when I moved. Didn't know why at the time, just couldn't leave it behind in the old house. Sat down on the floor of the new living room with it in my hand. The carved fish was still smooth, the cord still intact. I thought about that kid in the Philippines with the missing tooth. About how he probably remembered selling me that necklace for about 10 minutes before he moved on with his life. About how the necklace had spent 4 years sitting in a box on a shelf in a house full of someone who didn't want it. And about how, after all that, it had outlasted the marriage that ignored it. I put it in a drawer in the new place. I take it out sometimes, not for any sad reason, just to remember what it cost me to learn what I learned. That's worth keeping around. Still at sea, still chief. 5 more years until I think about retiring. Maybe I'll meet someone in port. Maybe I won't. Either way, the engines still run, the contracts still come in, and the box stays in the drawer. The ocean doesn't care who you used to be married to, and that's the best feature it has.